Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Rumiantova. I am the Associate Coordinator for the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel. And I am so excited to be here today. This was an event that I've been planning for a couple of months now. I'm really excited about the speakers that were able to join us for today's presentation, and for our gracious MC, Rashida Phillips, who I will be introducing in just a minute. I wanted to present a little bit about what the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel does. We are an association of over 600 partners and participants nationwide, all committed to advancing the civil right to counsel and encouraging, supporting, and coordinating efforts across the country to establish and enact the right to counsel for low-income folks in civil cases where basic human needs are at stake, including shelter, safety, sustenance, custody, issues like that. So we're really excited about this event. We have a series of speakers to get through, and also a video that we'll be presenting. And I'm going to introduce our MC for today, Rashida Phillips. And Rashida has graciously agreed to MC the event, despite just kind of changing jobs and starting out as the Director of Housing at PolicyLink, a national research and action institute dedicated to advancing racial and economic equity. So Rashida previously served as the managing attorney of housing policy at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and many of you might recognize Rashida from there. Rashida began a career at CLS in 2008 in the Community Economic Development Unit, providing legal advice, representation, and engaging in community lawyering on behalf of small child care, for-profit and non-for-profit organizations. And then Rashida trained on racial justice and housing law issues and skills throughout the country, previously serving as a senior advocate, resources and training attorney at Shriver Center on Poverty Law. Rashida is the recipient of the 2017 National Housing Law Project Housing Justice Award, the 2017 City and State Pennsylvania 40 Under 40 Rising Star Award, and the 2018 Temple University Black Law Student Association Alumni Award. Rashida graduated in 2008 from Temple University, Beasley School of Law, and 2005 graduated from Temple University. We are super excited to have Rashida here, and I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. This event will be recorded, and we will be running through until about 2:15 this afternoon. If you are on the phone and listening in, there will be shortly a period of time where you're going to hear a lot of music. I hope that you can join us on the computer so that you could watch what's kind of happening during that musical part. But if not, I hope that you really enjoy the music. And Rashida, take it away.
Thanks so much, Maria. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for having me as the MC for this amazing event. We're really just using this hour to recognize the immense progress that's been made on the tenant right to counsel front in the last 5 years. In 2017, right, we were in a place where no jurisdiction had a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And since then, it's virtually swept the nation. There's now 16 jurisdictions, including 3 states. And really, it couldn't have come at a better time, right? Many more are ready to join them in 2022. And it took organizers, coordinators, supporters, tenants, everyone, right, to get to this moment. And so we're here to recognize that and recognize the roles that people have taken in advancing this critical movement. Just to tell you a little bit about Philadelphia and how we stepped into this space, Philadelphia has always been known as a city of homeowners, which meant supporting homeowners has typically been the foremost priority in addressing housing issues and housing instability. We were at a point where prior to around 2015, where we couldn't really name the housing crisis and name it in a way that we knew what was actually happening for renters. Despite a sort of robust legal services community, we only had 7 full-time housing attorneys to serve the over 22,000 people facing evictions each year. And where tenants were repped about 5% of the time and landlords about 85% of the time. This is not unique or exclusive to Philadelphia. Those statistics really mirror what was happening around the country in terms of tenant representation. And we also knew, right, that most of these tenants were Black women and their children. But in 2015, 2016, we were a very long way off from being able to name those realities, even just a few short years ago. A lot of things came together around that time to make it a reality for us to be able to step into this moment and to be able to name what was actually happening. One, Matt Desmond's Evicted book came out, which really swept the nation and allowed us to be able to, what advocates already knew was happening, right? But to be able to speak about it in a way that was popular and where people were open to really discussing the realities of race and housing instability. In Philadelphia, we had Council member Gim come into play and really just became a champion for the right to counsel movement. And without her, we would have never been able to achieve what we were able to achieve. But most importantly, watching the movement begin and unfold in New York City showed us, inspired us to step into this space and to understand that right to counsel was critical, was extremely necessary towards the end of reducing housing instability and homelessness, and one that recognizes that housing is one of the most important stabilizing factors as a gateway to employment, education, every other aspect of life and life opportunity, and a tool that promotes racial and gender equity, most importantly. And then also, most importantly, a movement that centered the people most impacted, where watching New York City and the tenants and tenant organizers really rise, just again, really inspired us and allowed us in Philadelphia to follow the blueprint and make it a reality for us. And it's now more important than it ever was that people have access to home as a source of stability so that we can begin to rebuild our communities and heal our communities. And with that, I will get us started with sharing a short Right to Counsel compilation looking at all the progress that's already been made around the country on Right to Counsel.
Awesome. Thank you, Rashida. I am going to share my screen and to share that video. And yep. All right, folks. Again, if you're on the phone, you're going to hear some music, and we hope that you just enjoy it for a couple of minutes.
I think it's at the end of the video, Maria. You might just drag it back to the beginning.
You're right. All right, folks. So I hope that got you a little bit pumped, because it did me. I really, it's just a really fun way to recognize everything that's kind of happened in the last 4 to 5 years. It's amazing the progress that we've made. Rashida, back to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm absolutely excited about that video. And again, just absolutely amazing progress that we've seen happen around the nation. And that's the makings of a movement. That is the mark of a movement. It's not individualized, it is taking hold. So next, we're going to spotlight some of our folks who have been a part of this movement and really making it happen. And we're going to start with the organizers. Tenant organizing, as everyone on this call knows, is a critical component of the right to counsel movement. In fact, to me, without tenant organizer, there is no movement. They are the backbone of the movement. They do the heavy lifting to move, shift, or dismantle the systems and to build and take back power, all while holding advocates and other power brokers accountable. New York City and Boulder are prime examples of the forces that organizing can play in the enactment of the right to counsel legislation or the passage of a right to counsel ballot initiative, at the implementation phase, making sure that outreach is being done and that people even know that it's happening, that right to counsel is in your city or in your jurisdiction. We're going to start with New York City organizers, since New York City was the first city to inspire the nation and lay out the blueprint by enacting a right to counsel for tenants in 2017, specifically driven by the work of tenants and tenant organizers. I'm excited to introduce Nigel Murphy from Right to Counsel New York City Coalition and the Flatbush Tenants Coalition. Nigel has been a member leader with Flatbush Tenant Coalition for the past 4 years and counting, a relationship that started all due to being a disgruntled tenant herself. She is also a tenant leader in the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition, Housing Courts Must Change campaign. And since joining, she says, I have learned tremendously and still do, and look forward to building a community that is well informed and knows their rights when it comes to facing corrupt organizations, politicians, and landlords. Nigel continues to be a pillar in her community, and I'm so excited that she's here with us today to talk about her work on the Right to Counsel movement in New York City.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm very excited. I just wanted to give you a year in review of what we have done so far and moving forward. We created Right to Counsel to offer free representation in housing courts for low-income tenants citywide. It is used to transform the courts from an eviction machine to a place that holds landlords accountable, uphold tenants' rights, and enables tenants to stay in their homes. In 2020, we launched our statewide Housing Courts Must Change campaign, and our goals were to slow down eviction cases and expand right to counsel across the state so all tenants have and know about their rights and are emboldened to organize and fight to stop evictions. With that, we accomplished so much to reach our goals and wanted to share what we built in 2021 to take inspiration from and use it to propel us to 2022. In spring of 2021, COVID-19 Emergency Evictions and Foreclosure Protection Act to provide temporary protection the tenant submitted if they submitted a tenant's hardship declaration form. We collaborated by launching with Just Fix NYC and Housing Justice for All, evictionfreenewyork.org, and their websites that enable tenants to submit their declaration forms online. We released Eviction Crisis Monitor, which are resources showed how many tenants, landlords try to evict people in New York State since the start of COVID-19, and made right to counsel even stronger in New York by passing local law 54, where all incomes eligible tenants now have right to counsel, and local law 53 online, which made tenant organizing part of right to counsel. We also launched a campaign to guarantee right to counsel for all tenants across New York State, with bill sponsored by Assembly Member LaToya Joyner and Senator Rachel May. In the summer, we gathered with all organizers, tenants, and attorneys from around New York City and campaign planning retreats to look back at our work. We presented statewide right to counsel teachings, teaching tenants in all 5 boroughs and Syracuse to come together to talk about what eviction crisis look like statewide and in their communities, and to learn about right to counsel and how important legislation can help stop evictions. We also marched to end winter evictions by gathering together tenants, clergy, and communicating groups to speak out against the cruelty and inhumanity of evictions and to demand an end to evictions during cold months statewide. And we also released the worst COVID-19 victors together with Just Fix New York and New York City and anti-eviction managing mapping project, and many more to come with marches and protests in 2022.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work, Nigel. People like you are just absolutely the heart of this work. And I think we all appreciate or can appreciate how challenging it can be to share your story and to take your own story and experiences and use it to help and empower others. And if people who have, we know that, right, the people who have experienced eviction and housing instability have the solutions. And when we center their leadership and solutions, that really is the only way forward. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for your work. Just thank you for everything. So now we're going to go to Boulder, Colorado. Organizers in Boulder launched their No Eviction Without Representation campaign and won the right to counsel via ballot initiative in the middle of the pandemic. And so I'm going to introduce Rui Arango from Democratic Socialists of America. Rui is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He was the campaign chair for the 2020 No Eviction Without Representation ballot measure in the city of Boulder, and he's going to talk more about that and what organizing looked like for right to counsel in Boulder.
Yeah, so in Boulder, we were inspired by the victories of tenants against landlords in New York City, and in particular in San Francisco, where their Democratic Socialists of America DSA chapter managed to pass their own No Eviction Without Representation or newer ballot measure. What was special about what happened in San Francisco and really inspired us was that their program was entirely universal. It was not means tested at all. So it provided free legal counsel to every single tenant that experienced eviction there. And that program is in effect in San Francisco. And all of us together, we started out as a boxing club and quickly realized that, we were all tenants and workers. And so what that means is, as a tenant, we didn't own the places in which we lived. We paid a landlord for the privilege of living where we were. And as workers, we don't own the own means of our production. We work for someone else, and they pay us to make them extra money to produce a surplus for them. And so with that kind of double whammy, we decided that we wanted to fight, and we wanted to push back and attack landlords, essentially. And I hope all of you want to attack landlords here as well. And we decided that we wanted to emulate our comrades in New York, San Francisco, and a lot of other places, and develop Boulder's own right to counsel program. We set out doing that. We did an eviction study. We knocked on doors. We harassed people. We shouted at people. We had a good old time of it. And ultimately, we got our ballot measure on the ballot, and it was passed pretty unanimously by the voters. So No Eviction Without Representation Boulder provides not only a free attorney to every single tenant that experiences eviction, regardless of age, income, or immigration status. I'll say that again, every single goddamn tenant, regardless of age, income, or immigration status. And it's important that in the struggle for these programs in the future, you make it non-means tested, because if you don't, means testing just stops people from accessing the service, right? So we're lucky enough that didn't happen here, and I hope it won't happen anywhere else where right to counsel is active. In addition, our program provides rental assistance. That's a really important component of this, right? It's just money that that you give to tenants who are going to get evicted for not being able to pay the rent, which is the most common reason for getting evicted. We all know landlords just keep pushing the rent up and up and up, and people can't afford it. They get kicked out and are replaced by even wealthier people, right? So the right to an attorney, non-means tested, and the right to rental assistance that is not means tested means that tenants in Boulder are less likely to wind up in eviction court with the rental assistance. And if they do wind up in eviction court, then they will have that attorney to give them the best chance to fight against their landlord and keep their housing. So we're really happy about that. We also have in Boulder a tenant committee that is an advisory committee that was included as part of the legislation to help advise the city. We are, as workers and renters are, and I think everyone here should be as well, pretty distrustful of folks who are not in those classes, right? If a program is supposed to help tenants and renters and it's not being run by tenants and renters, which is the reality in a lot of places, a lot of cities, that should give you cause for concern. So we did include that as well. And that's just getting off the ground. And we're hopeful that the voices of the people the program is designed to serve will not be lost in the shuffle. And finally, I want to say this because it's real important. We made the landlords pay for our program in Boulder. I know that in different cities, you might have different city charters. What you can do there might be limitations there, but the landlords pay for the program that helps tenants in the city of Boulder. That was really politically attractive because no one likes landlords, to put it frankly, right? And no one wants to pay sales taxes for programs like this. So anyone who's thinking about a program like this in the future in their own city or state, I would encourage you to look at that. Here in Boulder, it was an excise tax. Other cities do have rental license fees, that sort of thing. And that we raised more than enough money to fund, to create a very well-funded program here in Boulder. Last thing I'll say is this shit's not just going down in Boulder, right? Just south of us in Denver, we have a city that is in the midst of an eviction crisis, a gentrification crisis. And there's another group of all volunteers. These people have real life crappy jobs that they go to, just like the one I'm going to go to in 20 minutes. And these volunteers are working very hard to get Newer Denver off the ground, to get an anti-eviction right to counsel program off the ground in Denver. And if you want to help out and do something material, I just put the link to donate to their campaign in the chat room. If you want to send a couple dollars their way, that would be hugely appreciated because none of us got paid on our campaign. We were all volunteers, and it's mostly volunteers who get this done. So it'd mean a lot if you could. And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rui. So Rui and Nigel just gave us examples of how diverse a movement can truly be. Two different approaches, right? But both of those approaches spoke to local conditions and political realities, but the results are the same: evening the playing field for tenants, dismantling and disrupting the vicious cycle of injustice of landlord-tenant court, shifting power dynamics, and deepening racial justice and equity in housing access. Another huge component of the right to counsel movement are the right to counsel coordinators, who in some places are active in the push for right to counsel, but then are definitely involved in the implementation once it passes. While organizers play one of the most vital roles in coordination, other key stakeholders and coordinators include legal aid programs and attorneys representing tenants. We're going to hear from two different coordinators working to implement their right to counsel, one out of Cleveland and the other out of Washington State. So first, I'm very pleased to introduce Hazel Ramesh, from the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. Hazel is a supervising attorney in the housing practice group at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. She has devoted her career to addressing the legal issues of low-income tenants. She concentrates her practice on the representation of low-income residents and tenant groups in housing matters, including eviction defense, affirmative litigation, appellate advocacy, administrative advocacy, and systemic advocacy to address poverty issues. In 2017, Hazel was awarded the Innovation Mission Fellowship through the Sisters of Charity Foundation of Cleveland. This is a fellowship awarded to 5 recipients who explore ideas to fight poverty in Cleveland. As part of this fellowship, Hazel led legal aid's advocacy to establish a right to counsel for low-income people in housing cases. Hazel has received many awards, but just to name a few, she's gotten the Leadership Award for Outstanding Staff Leadership and the Claude E. Clark Award for Professional Performance and Commitment to Legal Aid and its clients. In 2019, she was also recognized as a Cleveland City Champion by the Plain Dealer, and in 2020 received the Professionalism Award from the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. She has also served on the board of directors for the Cleveland Tenant Organization and is a National Institute Trial Advocacy faculty member. Hazel received her BS degree from Florida International University in 2002 and her JD from St. Thomas University. Hazel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rashida, and thanks everyone for having me on this panel today. It's really inspiring to see that video, Maria. Even, I've been in this work now a couple of years, working on right to counsel issues, and I still was really inspired by it, so I appreciate that. I wanted to just spend a few minutes giving a little bit of background of how we got to where we're at in Cleveland, and just a preview of what you all will see in an upcoming report that will be released at the end of this month, pointing to the results that we've had in Cleveland. So just a quick background, as Rashida mentioned, I was awarded a fellowship back in 2017 to work on a project that would have a high impact on poverty in the city of Cleveland. I spent most of my career doing eviction defense, so I sort of really deeply understood how critical it was and how different the outcomes are when somebody is represented by an attorney as opposed to someone who is not. At the time in the city of Cleveland, only 1% of tenants were represented by an attorney when they were facing an eviction. And that was traditionally a legal aid attorney who was coming into court with that tenant. And so we worked, unlike some of the other jurisdictions that you are hearing from, Cleveland does not have an organization that does tenant organizing. And so we really had to, educate the community on the impact of eviction, educate our policymakers, and really, begin to create those networks of folks that really would be paying attention to, how detrimental it is when somebody gets evicted in the community. And so we created an advisory committee that included our city council president at the time and other council members, and really began to think about what could this look like in the city of Cleveland. John and the National Coalition served as, such a resource for us as we were building and really learning about what this could look like and what would be effective, because not every city is the same. And so we ultimately in 2019, we worked on an ordinance by invitation from the city, and the ordinance passed unanimously, and it became effective July 1st, 2020. So really early on in the pandemic, we were launching this program, and really early it became evident to us how actually, as bad timing as that might sound, how critical it was during that point in people's lives when, we were talking about stay-at-home orders and staying in place, and how critical it was for people to not be evicted. And right to counsel really became a force in that critical moment. When the CDC order was enacted, for example, it was really important for attorneys to be going into court and raising those protections on behalf of tenants who were facing eviction. And so really, while some might say that it was bad timing, it really was so critical at that stage where we were at in the pandemic. And so fast forward, we've been, Right to Counsel Cleveland has been in effect now for almost a year and a half. Our second report is going to be released at the end of this year. And just to give you all a little preview, we went from that 1% representation rate to 16% representation rate in all eviction proceedings. And of eligible households, about 60% of households that are eligible or likely eligible for right to counsel are now getting representation. So I should mention that our ordinance is not as broad as some of the other jurisdictions that you all have heard from. It is applies to folks who have a child in the household and are at 100% of the federal poverty guidelines. So really, this is really a really impoverished community. And really, sort of last resort. So it's really great that 60% of those households are getting representation now. And as you saw in that video, some of our outcomes, we've been able to prevent eviction or involuntary move in 93% of our cases. That has been a consistent statistic for the last year and a half. So even when we looked at the first 6 months, we expected that there would be some decrease, but we've actually have sustained that percentage throughout the course of the year and a half. We've secured rental assistance. Again, a critical piece of the pandemic was all of the rent assistance to keep people housed. We've been able to secure rental assistance in 83% of the cases that we've handled. There are instances where our clients have to vacate and they have to move because that, for whatever reason, tenants, have to move, and we've been able to secure them time to move at 92% of the time. That's really huge because they're avoiding the trauma of having their stuff put out on the tree lawn and having to move with 7 to 10 days to move. So a huge, even if there's a relocation, there's still so much benefit to that representation. And we've secured monetary relief in 97% of our cases. I mean, those are judgments that are being avoided, rent that tenants, are getting reimbursed for, counterclaims that we have raised because of conditions issues in the unit. So really huge outcomes. And all of this is being detailed in a report that will come out at the end of this month. But one of the things that I think Maria asked me to touch on is sort of lessons learned. I think one of the things that's been really, really critical for us is having partners to do outreach with. It is so important that the word gets out, that people who are facing eviction can trust the folks that are providing the assistance, because so many times there's so much distrust in the system, and they choose not to show up in court as opposed to trying to access the service. So I think that's really, really critical, getting the word out, building that trust in the community, if you have those organizations in your community that are available to you. Data is so important. I think we see data as burdensome in collecting, but really so critical in making the case going forward and proving how important this work and this movement actually is. So important. And really for the work to be client focused, and really, thinking about the trauma that tenants are experiencing when they're going through this process. And as an advocate and a provider, really keeping that at the forefront as we're providing services. So I'm just so excited to see this movement and everybody here, and thank you guys for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Hazel, and thank you so much for your incredible, incredible work. Another place that is truly a model for not only dealing with the issue of poverty and what low income folks have to face in terms of being able to access housing, but again, truly understanding sort of the racial equity nature of housing insecurity and eviction, and being able to build that into your program priorities. It's just really something that, again, people around the nation have really looked at and been inspired by. So thank you so much. Now I'm extremely pleased to introduce Jim Bamberger from the Office of Civil Legal Aid in Washington. Jim Bamberger is the founding director of the Washington State Office of Civil Legal Aid, an independent judicial branch agency that administers and oversees legislatively appropriated funding for a wide range of legal aid services throughout Washington State. He serves by appointment of the Washington State Supreme Court. Prior to joining OCLA in 2005, Bamberger served in many positions with Alliance for Equal Justice, Washington State's integrated statewide legal aid system. In addition to his work in Washington State, Jim has consulted with the Legal Services Corporation and with state civil justice communities around the country. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jim has worked to identify and secure state and federal emergency funding needed to address the waves of legal problems experienced by low-wage workers, unemployed people, victims of violence, and others directly affected by the crisis. Since April 2021, Jim has led Washington State's efforts to implement the nation's first appointed counsel program for indigent tenants. Really looking forward to hearing from Jim on coordinating right to counsel in Washington.
Well, thank you, Rashida and Maria. Terrific video. I really want to commend you on that. I'm really humbled to be here with you today, and particularly those of you who are the voices, the powerful voices, who have given rise and feed this movement. As Rashida said, I work for state government. One could characterize my job as being in the nature of a bureaucrat, but the responsibility with which our agency has now been entrusted is really because of the powerful voices of the organizers across our state, of many and very diverse communities, the Latinx community, the BLM efforts, the community of just general tenant organizers, labor and beyond. And the messages that they have shared across our state, and so powerfully done so, were that the harms to tenants as a result of laws that have historically been balanced in favor of landlords and against tenants need to be stopped, need to be mitigated, and voices need to be given power in a new set of relationships. You know, we talk about in our state, and I think nationally, we talk about landlord-tenant law as lawyers. We talk about it as a body of law focused on property rights. And historically, that body of law, which has been written by landlords and landlord lawyers over the course of many years, that body of law has focused almost exclusively on the property rights of landlords. What gets lost and what is now being found and recognized are the property rights and the human rights of tenants. And so in our state, where we are now implementing the nation's first, as best we know, appointed counsel program for indigent tenants, we are actually empowering those voices. We are moving from a legal aid model that is based on scarcity and limited resource allocation, pick and choose, in and out, short-term representation. We are now moving to a model much like the indigent defense model in the criminal justice system and the child welfare system, where a tenant is guaranteed that the court will appoint them a lawyer to represent them from start to finish in their what we call unlawful detainer or eviction case. It's been a heavy lift for us. The legislature passed this in April of 21. We're not at April of 22 yet. And we were given 90 days to develop a plan for implementation. And then we were given a year to implement. But you know what? Tenants couldn't wait a year. And I'm also governed by a message I keep on my desk all the time, which very simple phrase, nothing about us without us. And in the course of developing our implementation plan, we made sure that the tenant voices were at the table, that the consumers were driving and ensuring that we were grounding all of our work in equity considerations and out of respect for the real understanding of the real needs of those who are the beneficiaries and our partners, honestly, in implementing this program. I've posted in the chat a link to our implementation plan that we published in July. We're in the process of updating it because, as you can imagine, we're learning a ton as we try to implement a program across a non-unified state court system involving 37 different judicial districts, involving a geographic and demographic state that is as diverse as any in the country, from rural eastern and southeastern Washington, which is heavily agricultural, to the heavily populated areas on our side of the state, the west side of the state, and the Puget Sound region. We operationalized the Right to Counsel program effectively starting in October, making sure that we had well-trained, highly qualified, fully dedicated Right to Counsel lawyers available to accept appointments from courts to represent their tenants. We are now fully operational throughout the state of Washington, from the Northeast to the Southwest, from the Northwest to the Southeast, and everywhere in between. And it could not have come any sooner. Unfortunately, we are now facing the kind of post-moratorium bump or tsunami or whatever you want to use term. We are now facing that crisis. And the great thing is we've got lawyers on the ground working directly with tenants. And the biggest challenge we have now is making sure that those members of those communities, particularly the LEP communities, the rural communities, the Native communities in Native Washington, and in our urban areas and others, understand that they actually have a right to counsel and that they know where and how to access that right. And so we undertook a $250,000 statewide, heavily targeted outreach program, education and outreach program that's still going on right now, just to help people understand that the rules of the game have changed and that tenants do have rights, and that they do have legal voice, and how to get legal voice. So it's an extraordinarily exciting time. We would not be here, first and foremost, without the voices of those who are most directly at risk of harm and are being harmed and have historically been harmed. And we certainly wouldn't be here without the tremendous support of the National Coalition and leaders across jurisdictions in so many and a growing number of jurisdictions across the nation. So it's, again, it's a terrific honor to be here and to celebrate with all of you the movement that we are all a part of from whatever place we stand or sit. And I'm just cherish this opportunity to share with you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I echo those words. I want to also thank folks who have been driving the national movement and keeping us together. The folks who are responsible for this celebration today, particularly John and Maria, your work has been incredible. And so thank you as well. And thank you, Jim, for uplifting that. So next, we're going to move on to our last category of folks here, which is our supporters. And so talking about the right to counsel supporters, right? These are the important players in the policy, political, and funding spheres. The folks who support can also be extremely vital and necessary for right to counsel to pass. Right to counsel legislation often cannot happen, right, without a broad coalition of stakeholders, including city council members and state legislators. As I talked about earlier, tenant rights were not always a priority for Philadelphia. Less than a decade ago, we were in a space where tenants were stereotyped as transient, as deadbeats, as people who did not care about their communities and neighborhoods. Tenants being evicted were painted with one stroke. They were people who were poor or people who had done something to cause their circumstances. The conversation was not at all focused on the severe power imbalance, the severe substandard housing conditions, and severe housing discrimination that many people in Philadelphia, and again, mirroring around the country, were facing. These deeply entrenched ideas about tenants reflected the values and priorities that the city of Philadelphia took in terms of elevating tenant rights and resources. And for that reason, it took something a little bit more than political will to shift that narrative. You need hope, you need belief. And in Philadelphia, Helen Gim was one of those people who listened to those who experienced housing insecurity and those who said the courts were unfair, and she believed. She believed that their experiences were true. She believed that advocates, tenants, and organizers who told her that right to counsel was one of the solutions to the housing crisis devastating the city. And one of the first things that she did, she and her staff did, that would inevitably change the future for how the city would come to address tenant rights and issues, was to hold a hearing in town halls on right to counsel eviction crisis back in 2017. She did not take for granted that the eviction courts were working fairly or that tenants had access to legal advice or other resources. Those hearings and town halls directly led to a task force and, most importantly, funding to pilot a right to counsel program, and finally, legislation that passed unanimously in City Council in 2019. This year, Philadelphia is set to roll out the first phase of right to counsel. Every movement needs a champion, and I'm really pleased to introduce a person who takes the title for the people's champion. And even though I'm living in Los Angeles now, she is still and always will be my city council member. So City Council member Helen Gim is a longtime educator, a community organizer, someone who is leading a human rights agenda for housing, public education, and racial and economic justice through Philadelphia City Council. Seated in 2016, she led the end of a 2-decade-long state takeover of the Philadelphia schools and restored nurses, counselors, music programs, and safe drinking water to every public school. She championed and won free SEPTA fares for children, helped pass right to counsel legislation set to launch in February, and has led an aggressive agenda to reform residential facilities for youth due to abuse of children in their care. During the COVID crisis, Councilmember Helen Gim helped lead the development of Philadelphia's nationally acclaimed eviction diversion program. She helped establish a rental assistance and diversion program that provided $240 million in rent checks to protect Philadelphia renters. She pushed for guaranteed internet access for students and won a national campaign to improve internet speeds for Comcast low-income customer programs. And currently, she is championing a school modernization campaign to address the conditions of Philadelphia's aging school buildings. Councilmember Gim is co-chair of Local Progress, a national organization of municipal elected officials, where she leads campaigns for sanctuary cities and economic justice, and obviously doesn't sleep. So I'm so pleased to introduce Councilmember Helen Gim today.
Thank you so much, Rashida. It's so wonderful, first of all, to be here with so many amazing people around the country who are inspiring us in this moment, and to have all the people who are watching who've been incredible champions back at home, wherever home may be for you. And of course, thank you, Rashida. You are truly the conscience of our city. You have helped breathe humanity and compassion into our Philadelphia laws and change the way that we look at what's possible. And it is not in any way an exaggeration to say that I would not be here today without you, for sure. I also want to echo the support for the National Coalition, NCCRC, Maria, especially for your work in helping put this together. And I am blown away by Nigel, Rui, Hazel, Jim, and all the speakers for sharing their stories and their work today. So I'm Helen Gim, and I'm a city council member in Philadelphia. I've been on city council now for about 6 years, but I come into this work after 2 decades of organizing in movements for justice. And that's really how I think about almost everything in terms of approaches towards politics, towards policy, and for supporting work on the ground. Evictions first came into my life when I was a public school teacher, which made very clear the impact that evictions had on young children. I share a little bit about some of my work and background, particularly in immigrant, Asian American, and public education communities, many of which are shut out of traditional means of power, because it's so important to how we look at the right to counsel movement, and more importantly, the housing as a human right movement moving forward as well. And that is that I think all of our speakers have said this, but we, in a world in which so much of policy and politics is determined by stereotypes and biases that oppress and suppress people's voices and erases their lives from government and from policy and from budgets, the most important place that we have to start and continue to grow throughout the process is about the rights of people to speak their realities. Philadelphia is the poorest large city in the country, and pre-pandemic, we were the 4th highest evicting city in the country. We did when I first came in 2016, we did over 22,000 evictions every single year. That's hundreds and hundreds of evictions every single week, 52 weeks out of the year. And as Rashida has long mentioned, and I think many of us already know, the data that we had on what was happening to evictions was undeniable in its harm, in its racism, and in its impact on communities that were most at need here in our city of Philadelphia. Over thousands of evictions, we found that 74% targeted a Black tenant. 70% of them involved a woman, and over half or around half involved a caregiver or a parent. This was no longer an issue merely between a landlord and a leasee, a private contract, which is oftentimes how landlord-tenant issues often get cast as. This had to be an issue for an entire city, but it's not someone like myself that has to say it. It's why, as Rashida noted, we didn't start with policy, because if I had started with policy in the city council that I currently had occupied in 2016, that policy would not have made its way through, or even if it had made its way through, it would not have sustained itself through all the changes that we've seen over the last 6 years. We don't start with policy. We don't start with politics. We start with us, because the politics and the policies have to be about us, the people. And that's why when Rashida mentioned the importance of opening up with the town halls, with the community meetings, with getting stories out there, with working closely with media, or to use our own media outlets to tell our own stories, that remains one of the most powerful things that we start with, we continue, and we continue to evolve. I'll say then that, over the course of time, pulling people into a movement that they themselves can see themselves in, and sustaining themselves through, was one of the most important things as well. So the next step is a Philadelphia anti-eviction task force, one that actually does work, and led to, among significant things was a kickoff to a just cause law, the start of local housing vouchers, which would eventually evolve into a form of the PHL Rent Assist program, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But most importantly, knitting together a group of activists, tenants' rights folks, city agencies, and elected officials who would see a vision through over the last 6 years. Together, we brought together and made sure that we talked about evictions, not just on a landlord and a tenant, but on the overall community health, on the human and health impacts of substandard housing, of a child's education, of jobs and employment, of opportunity, and the future of our city. And then I'll say that in June of 2017, we were really excited after a full year on council, a full budget process. We led the charge to win a first very small line item for legal aid for low-income renters facing eviction. A tenant legal defense fund of $500,000 was a drop in the bucket. But what it ended up being was a foothold that would burst open years of, that would help continue to fund more storytelling, more capacity building for our organizers, more collaboration amongst our city agencies, eventually our courts, and among city council, and then ultimately would lead to not just $500,000, but today about $3.5 million a year, every single year, dedicated to the continuing work of ending evictions in the city of Philadelphia and ensuring housing as a human right. Now, the couple of things that I wanted to address, well, before I get into that, I'll go quickly. We passed a number of different laws, including right to counsel in 2019, and of course, then the pandemic hit. But when you've done this work for a while, most of us know that when you go into crisis, this is not when everything falls apart. It's when everything crystallizes, when the priorities become undeniable and clear. And as has been mentioned before, and as Hazel, I think, said very clearly, the pandemic with stay-at-home orders meant that evictions had to come to a screeching halt. Philadelphia was one of the earlier cities, certainly led by wonderful people who are on this call already, who enacted the first eviction moratorium. We piloted an eviction diversion program requiring that their landlords first seek rent assistance and file for mediation before being able to file for an eviction. And I'll talk very quickly about outcomes, but then I want to talk through lessons learned, right? 2 years of a pandemic, in the 4th highest evicting city in the country, in the poorest large city in the country. meant that we were able to reduce eviction filings by 75% in our city. That our mediation program that funded not just like housing counselors that showed up, but a whole like new sector of people who are now going to go on and help support individuals facing mortgage foreclosure, businesses and others, and continue to expand the work around right to counsel and others. Now we have a burgeoning industry of educated people who are neighborhood based. That program has also, like Hazel mentioned, a 93% success rate in avoiding evictions. It's helped push through almost $250 million in federal rent assistance money, which allowed for Philadelphia to be one of the most efficient cities in the nation in distribution of federal dollars that came through. But I want to take a second here to go through some of the things that we learned and some things that I want the Right to Counsel movement to continue to dedicate itself to. One is that oppressive systems don't just come through one angle. All of us know this, right? Like, so passing right to counsel isn't going to end evictions in and of itself. Evictions become an oppressive process because they're echoed through so many different agencies. A city agency that isn't used to having a modern rent assistance portal or even dedicating money to rent assistance. A municipal court that says, I don't care if the city council does a law, we will do our own thing. One of the things that we've learned in the right to counsel movement, in the anti-eviction work, is that a group of people has to stay together because oppressive systems fill spaces, even when we're, not whether we can understand them or not. They just close in all the blank spaces. So if we're going to be an effective force, we must also build out our own capacity to attack all those different places, to have a plan for addressing our municipal courts. We ended up seeing a dramatic change in leadership at our municipal courts, and we have a partner who has made everything possible for us within our municipal courts. We've done so by finding partners within our city government that are able to create modern technical portals like rent assistance that can sync and merge. And we've done it by dedicating ourselves to knowing that a housing justice movement is a racial justice movement, is a labor rights movement, is an education movement, and to continue to build in those things together. An intersectional, powerful force is necessary to continue on with this work. Right to counsel can't exist without that. Second, continuing to expand and develop and nurture storytelling on the ground. There's no question that over this time period that we've seen an incredible burst of energy around supporting right to counsel, supporting tenants' rights work, creative things that come out of crisis. But as this, what we know is that we were not responding to an emergency in crisis. We are trying to break off and away from a system of oppression, of impoverishment, of racism, and of denying people the right to housing. And instead, we need to move into more permanency. That means the same stories that resonated 2 years ago are not the same stories that need to resonate right now. We need to continue to develop our work on the ground with our organizers to understand how housing, how evictions, and how tenants' rights need to continue to evolve. We put ourselves in a spot where things that worked really well, even if they did really work well 2 years ago, they cannot be the same things that work well today. We must continue to evolve. We must continue to change and expand our community's capacity. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that, as we come to the end of, or hopefully a temporary pause, right, in the federal rent assistance money, we have to remind ourselves that this work starts on the ground. It does not start in Congress. It does not start with, elected officials. It starts on the ground. The capacity of cities, counties, municipalities to do this work, to reach out to tenants, to strengthen our city internally, government capacity to do this work, to want to do the work, to have the appetite to do more. And then, of course, to nurture organizing on the ground is one of the most important things that we can do, because ultimately, what we are seeing is going to be fast moving on the ground. And so municipalities, local context really matters. It's why some of my work around local progress, which is a national network of local municipal officials doing progressive policy on housing justice, among other things, has been working closely together to track and support municipal policies, municipal organizing, and to support local electeds around the country. You know, I think as we head into this Martin Luther King weekend, the Civil Right to Counsel has been a powerful mobilizing movement to understand how civil rights and human rights plays out today. I'm honored to join everybody on this coalition and just really humbled by my fellow panelists, and look forward to hearing more from everybody around the country.
Thank you so much, Council Member. Yeah, I'm gonna close up and then hand it over to John, but just want to reflect and echo those closing remarks from Council Member Gim, and really just everything that my co-panelists shared, and that many of you already on this call know already and say yourselves, right? But just the fact that if we have any hopes of being able to fundamentally break away from patterns of the past and sort of rupture this inadequate present moment, the future can't be envisioned any longer in the interest of one group at the expense of another. We can no longer sort of use these bootstrap narratives of personal responsibility and self-determination that treats only some of us as deserving of a roof over our heads. Our measure of progress must rely on how much we can transform our values to make homelessness intolerable and obsolete, providing equitable housing access across race, gender, age, ability, and sexuality as indispensable to our humanity. And Right to Counsel is one of the tools for achieving that. This movement is important not just because, right, it levels the playing fields or makes courts and supposedly justice more accessible, but more importantly, because as Councilmember Gim noted, a movement allows us to reflect our own stories and experiences, and each of us to see ourselves in it and find a role and a place where we can each achieve a common vision and goal and bold new futures. That future calls for us collectively reprioritizing our values to emphasize intergenerational housing stability and health, and eliminate the debt that keeps Black and Brown and Indigenous families forever running to catch up on a timeline of progress. Families can build wealth if that's what they want to do, access education, and avoid poverty when they aren't being pushed out of their communities through eviction, redevelopment, rising rents, property taxes, poor housing conditions, and when they are invested in, when their communities are invested in before they get pushed out and their neighborhoods gentrified. And so this movement does what it needs to do. It unapologetically prioritizes youth, Black and Indigenous and Brown people, formerly incarcerated, survivors of violence, women, seniors, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary folks, disabled people, immigrants, others who are disproportionately evicted or impacted by housing instability. And that's why this movement will win. So I'm going to pass to John, and he's going to give a short discussion of the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel, which has convened us all, and legislation we're expecting to see in 2022.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Rashida, for everything you've done today. I am just going to talk really briefly about what we expect coming down the pike for next year. And I'm just going to share my screen with you all so you can see. We're actually really excited for 2022, that 2021 was an incredible year because of everything that you've heard on this call today. The work that all of you have done around the country to advance this movement has created, and you know, this data, which came from Data for Progress last year, I don't think that we ever expected to see broad political support for right to counsel across the spectrum. You know, when you look at the top line, including Democrat, Independent, Republican, everyone, there is broad support for the concept of right to counsel. That is because of the work that all of you are doing out there to change people's minds, to push this issue, to advocate, to show your passion for this. That's what makes this possible. The media coverage, that is, you know, that the fact that this is now a mainstream media covered issue, that is the work that you all have done to raise the profile of this issue, to make this a human rights issue, to make people understand that this is a movement across the whole country. That is your work that has accomplished this. What we see coming in 2022, you know, as incredible as 2021 was, with as many jurisdictions that passed a right to counsel, 3 states and 8 cities, we had so many other states that actually introduced legislation in 2021 some of which we are actually expecting that carried over to 2022. We expect them to be worked on again this year, like Delaware and New York and Minnesota, and some of the other states, including some states where there's really great work being done to lay the groundwork in the future in the South and in the Midwest. There's going to be, as you heard, there's going to be a ballot initiative in Denver. It's not the only one. We're not quite sure what the other ones are going to be yet, so I don't want to speak prematurely. There's also been federal legislation to fund a right to counsel that's been filed by several members of Congress. And then there have been some of these, what we call universal rep jurisdictions, where they don't yet have an ordinance, but they're actually providing enough money for everyone to be represented. That's once the funding is in place, the ordinance is really much easier to get done. So we're really hopeful in some of these places that we'll see an actual right to counsel law in the very near future. So there's a lot, that these are just the places that we saw, or concretely know have, legislation, on the table or did have it on the table. And then there are all these other places, and this is not everywhere. This is just some of the places that we're supporting, that we know there are efforts going on, advocates, legal services organizations, tenant organizers, other community-based organizations, policymakers, funders, increasingly are getting excited about doing this themselves. The United Way is becoming a major player in the right to counsel. The Salvation Army is interested in the right to counsel. The Federal Reserve is interested in the right to counsel. That is the result of all of the work that you all are doing to get them excited and interested in this work. We also saw in 2021 an incredible number of jurisdictions tap into federal funding to advance the right to counsel, or to at least expand representation and put that jurisdiction in place to do a right to counsel. This is not even a complete list. This is just the places we know of that have done it. And as you can see, some of them have used it for right to counsel. Some of them are using it for universal representation. We expect much more of that, that work to continue in 2022. What we're going to do in this year to continue just to basically support all of what you're doing is do what we have done in the past, direct jurisdictional support to you, to policymakers and others. We have some webinars that we're planning to do about how to recruit attorneys, because that's such a big question right now, about how to get enough lawyers for a new right to counsel, how to create sustainable funding, data collection, and integrating race equity messaging. We're planning to do interviews of all the successful right to counsel jurisdictions, working with the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance to document, how did you all do this? Like, we don't want this just to be institutional memory. We want this to be written down so that everyone can learn from it without having to make a call and say, how did you do that? And then we have in the works a really comprehensive web-based guide on running a campaign, thinking through all of the questions that come up. The Right to Counsel New York City Coalition did a fantastic organizing toolkit. This will build upon the work that they did and add some other things like legal issues that can rise and implementation questions. We're going to continue to advocate for the most effective use of the federal funding, pushing Treasury to make it easier for legal services organizations to tap that money for right to counsel, and making sure that you all know about the incredible work that you each are doing. Because the more that information is out there, the more excitement that it builds, the more momentum that it creates. So you are all creating the momentum, and we will just help make sure that you each know how incredible you all are. That's the role that we play. So we're really excited for 2022. We think there are great things ahead. And that's because of you, the people here and the people who are not here today, that have done such incredible work to keep advancing the ball and speak so passionately, tell their stories, and convince policymakers and the policymakers that have joined the call to help make this happen. So thank you for everything you do. And I will turn it back to Rashida for last closing remarks.
So I think the last thing was maybe a video.
Oh, no, I think we're wrapped up, folks, and it's Friday everywhere. So thank you so much, everybody that joined on the call, and also all of the panelists. This was, I didn't think that I myself would be as inspired as I am walking into the weekend with all of this work. This was amazing. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. We're closing it out. The recording is gonna come out and share it far and wide. Let's get next year, we will have thousands of people kind of joining in on this effort, right? Just as they are, but yeah, congratulations. Thank you so much, everyone.